Other than the book of Revelation, the books of the prophets are the least read, least understood, and most intimidating to lay people and priests alike. The language in them can be mystifying, and if read only on a literal level, they can leave your mind reeling. At the end of the Old Testament, we're confronted with two sets of books: the major prophets, a set of 5 books, and the minor prophets, a set of 12 books. Now, the words major and minor are very misleading here. One makes us think in today's language that it's more advanced, more important, and the other somehow lacking. But this isn't the case. Major simply means it's longer. The writers were more prolific, covering a longer period of time, and in some cases are also considered more important writings. But for the most part, minor simply just means it's short. It covers a minor period of history. Not less important, just smaller. So before we jump into the prophetic writings, let's define what a prophet is and was in the context of these writings. Now, when I say the word prophet, my guess is that you think of someone with clairvoyant gifts or the ability to read the future. But prophets are people who, in our minds, while they might have supernatural gifts and abilities, etymologically are simply people who speak truth that's divinely inspired. The biblical prophets were called Nevi by the Hebrew people, and in the Hebrew Bible, their writings are called Nevim. They were, and still are seen, as intermediaries between God and God's people. Now, the main theme of the prophetic writings is injustice, righteousness, and faithfulness to God's covenant. This is not a new pattern. We saw it arise at the very beginning of creation with God's disappointment of Adam and Eve's disobedience, and we see it time and time again as the Hebrew people struggle to be faithful throughout the historical writings. So, when the prophets approach the issues of righteousness and justice, they're typically approaching either the monarch, the people in general, or the lead priest and rabbinical guidance over the Hebrew people. The words prophet, prophecy, and prophetess are used approximately 550 times in the Bible. They make up a significant and substantial portion of the historical writings, as well as their own prophetic stories in the Old Testament. The first time we see the word prophet, it's used in the Bible by God, speaking to a Canaanite king about the patriarch Abraham in Genesis 20. Then the second and third time prophet is used in the Bible, it's God speaking to the great patriarch Moses, telling him that his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam will serve as prophets for and to him. Then in Numbers 12:6, we're told by God that God's wisdom and truth are made known to the prophets by visions and dreams. But we're also warned in the Bible by God that there are such things as false prophets, those who claim to have heard or seen wisdom from God, but who in fact have not. Now, the role of prophets not gender-based. We see both men and women being called to be prophets of God. And the origins of this group of biblical prophets is not unique to the Hebrew people. In fact, prophetic work was something culturally accepted throughout ancient Mesopotamia. Now, you can imagine, though, that the biblical prophets, they stand out because while all the other prophets throughout various kingdoms, Hebrew or not, were supporting the monarchy, basically cheerleaders for whatever the king wanted, these prophets in the Bible are speaking out against the king, the king's people, and the king's priest because of specific concerns of how they are breaking their covenant with the one true God. Basically, as my OT professor in seminary called it, the prophets were the troublers of Israel. The prophetic writings in your Bible are not in order chronologically. The major prophets are put first, even though it's the minor prophets, Amos, Hosea, and Micah, whose writings are older and depict the life of Israel before the fall of the northern kingdom to Assyria. Now, the prophetic writings cover roughly a period of 450 years. The prophetic writings surround the catastrophic decline and destruction of the northern and southern kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Part of the reason why these writings are so difficult for us to read is because they cover very difficult, emotional, terrible times in history when families were ripped apart, when the chosen people of Israel were exiled and treated yet again as slaves, and when the destruction of a glorious and once unified nation is the focal point of the writings. In the prolific writings of the major prophets, we experience the sheer terror of impending invasions and destruction. Jeremiah is especially visceral. For example, he says, my anguish, I writhe in pain. Oh, the walls of my heart are beating wildly. I cannot keep silent, for I hear the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. The majority of the prophets are from the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom fell first and swiftly, but each of the kingdoms, northern and southern, eventually fell. And these prophetic writings talk about all of the many ways that the prophets of God try to communicate how the Hebrew people should be prepared because they've broken the covenant that God had made with them. Amos is especially a perfect example, prophesying the coming destruction of the kingdom. Samaria is the first to fall, but the southern kingdom will eventually fall too. These are difficult writings, but even in the midst of them, there is hope. We see prophecies and oracles about a future king, a Messiah, who will one day come and reunite the Hebrew people. But that's where we'll have to end it today. We'll see you next week with Bible 101.